Good morning once again, everyone. I'm Stephen Piven, this is Hebrew State Ministry, and today let's discuss the 12 minor prophets that make up the end of the Old Testament. Before we begin, it's important to establish right off the bat how the 12 minor prophets are broken up into two different groups. The first 9 are pre-exile prophets before Judah, before the Jews were taken into the Babylonian captivity. From Hosea to Zephaniah, they're all pre-exile, so they're mixing in a lot of warnings about the judgment of Nebuchadnezzar coming in and taking them into exile. The last 3 are post-exile. All of them speak on the millennial reign, the latter days, judgment to come, the day of the Lord. All of those topics are scattered throughout these 12 minor prophets. They're very little known prophets. You don't hear many preachers. You'll hear them cited every once in a while. They'll be alluded to, but there's never really much focus given to them as much as the 4 major prophets of Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Let's first begin with Hosea, the first of them. He preached for about 40 years from the time of about 760 to 720 BC. About 250 years after King David, and about 650 years after the Hebrew people had officially entered into the Promised Land, becoming the nation that we know of as Israel. Like Elijah and Elisha, Hosea preached unto the northern kingdom of Israel during the reigns of several different evil kings. The land of Israel is very prosperous during Hosea's preaching. He was not preaching unto a people whom felt they needed God. These people were wealthy, prosperous, growth was everywhere. Hosea is commanded by the Lord to do a thing considered contrary to the law of Moses, which was marry a prostitute, a harlot, an adulterous woman that we know of for a fact. Hosea 1, 2, and 3 states this: he is actually commanded to marry this woman. The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, Go take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare him a son. 2 sons and 1 daughter did Hosea have with Gomer. And like the prophet Isaiah, the names of all 3 of his children represented the fate of the nation. God was using the life of Hosea and the marriage with the harlot Gomer as a representation of his relationship to his own people in the northern kingdom. Because one must remember, we're not talking about Hosea in the context of him preaching to the Babylonian captivity. This is where the Assyrians and the Egyptians were about to take over the northern kingdom. He was warning them of this because it was about 150 years before the Jews were taken off into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar that the northern kingdom had already been scattered and lost their sovereignty. So the address here is God is talking to the northern kingdom of Israel, not Judah. His first son was named Jezreel, meaning scattered, as the people would soon be. But the boy was specifically given this name, as we're told in verse 4 of the first chapter, to represent the valley of Jezreel, where Jehu massacred the descendants of Ahab. You see, so God was coming against Jehu, for this judgment would soon come to the house of Jehu over this. His daughter was then born, God naming her Lorahumah, meaning no mercy, as God would, as verse 6 says, no more have mercy upon the house of Israel. His third child is then born, God naming him, his final son, Lo-ami, meaning not my people. For ye are not my people, and I will not be your God, as verse 9 of the first chapter states. God likens Israel to Hosea's wife Gomer, calling them harlots and adulteresses, as they worshipped many gods and were unfaithful perpetually. But even though Israel, like Hosea's wife, had done so many evil things against God, so many evil trespasses. I mean, have you ever been dating a woman, or even for you women, dating a man and they cheat on you? Nothing hurts more. The scripture actually tells us that the one sure way that you cannot bribe your way out of something, out of one position, it's the status of cheating. Whenever a cheater goes out, let's just say that you have a girlfriend or a wife, she goes out and she cheats. The man that she cheats with, as well as the woman, there's no bribe that they can give to cover up that. It's the one thing that it's just almost impossible to be forgiven, besides like the death or the harm of your family. But it's so crushing to be cheated on. And this is how God felt. He was showing his prophet, look, this is how I feel towards my people. Now you understand why I'm allowing them to be taken away. But once again, God loves them so much that he does promise to take them back. No matter all the evil deeds that they did to God, that he's seen thoroughly. And you have to understand, if me and you only see a fraction of these transgressions against us, it enrages us to the point where we never do forget it. But God sees their thoughts, their every movement, their motives, how much and how deep that they were into this transgression. He sees all these different layers in its totality, completely, all at once, right before his eyes. And he still, that's a good note on God's mercy and his love. But God commands Hosea to do the same, to take back Gomer whenever she is found to be in adultery. Hosea 3, 1 through 5. Then said the Lord unto me, Go yet, love a woman beloved of her friend, yet an adulteress, according to the love of the Lord toward the children of Israel, who look to other gods and love flagons of wine. So I bought her to me for 15 pieces of silver, and for an homer of barley, and a half homer of barley. And I said unto her, Thou shalt abide for me many days. Thou shalt not play the harlot, and thou shalt not be for another man. So will I also be for thee. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, and without a prince, and without a sacrifice, and without an image, and without an ephod, and without teraphim. Afterward shall the children of Israel return, and seek the Lord their God, and David their king, and shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. Now, two things to note big time. First of all, he commands according to the love of the Lord toward, okay, so he says, go yet, love a woman beloved of her friend. He's meaning go back and love her. He doesn't just say take her back. That would be much easier than loving her. Now, there's something to learn within that, because that means that love is not strictly driven by our emotional, consequential states of being. It can be willed. You can force yourself to love someone, because God says, go and love her. Now, I'm certain that God helped Hosea in this. But the second point to note there is how God says that they'll come back and they'll see David their king. And we know that David comes back during the millennial reign of the latter days, which God says. So until that time of restoration, they are still seen as harlots, and that he still allows them to play the harlot, play the adulteresses, until he comes back during the millennial reign. So it's still going on, their harlotry of the Jews and the Israeli people. At the very end of Hosea's ministry was Israel then enslaved, just as he had preached by Assyria and Egypt. So it was about 40 years. All of a sudden, at the end of that 40 years of mourning, that's a pretty good warning. Their fates were sealed. Next up, we have the prophet Joel, who was one of the earliest prophets of all of Scripture. Some people say that Joel and Job, these are the earliest of the prophets. Joel preaches during the reign of King Joash, around 835 to 796 BC. Again, about a 40-year-long ministry, just like Hosea. Joel begins prophesying during the time of the great locust. Now, you'll see these locusts in Africa now. They're being stirred up, and a lot of it says that it's, signs of the end of time. God's always used locusts, though, to judge a nation. So, there's been many swarms go out. I'm not saying that it's not a sign of the times, but, because I believe that it very well could be. I'll guarantee you this. As of right now, at this very moment, we are closer than we have ever been. So I think that's irrefutable. But, he preaches on this great locust swarm. And this was no typical locust swarm, okay? A judgment from God upon the southern kingdom of Judah. All right? So a great famine, so great was this famine that the locusts created. And it was also a drought. But so great was this that Joel tells the people to tell their children and them to tell their children from generation to generation of this locust swarm. The first chapter of Joel focuses on that present day judgment of locusts and drought. The second and third chapters, there's only 3 chapters, then promise to restore what the locusts destroyed in the day of the Lord. Of the 3 chapters written in Joel, chapters 2 and 3 focus on both the rapture and the second coming after God's wrath, establishing the millennial reign. Next up is the prophet Amos, who is my personal favorite of the minor prophets, one of my favorite prophets ever. A very little known prophet. I didn't know hardly anything about Amos until I started researching into the minor prophets. I have personally given Amos this one name in order to remember his message. I call him the inescapable judgment prophet. There's a reason for that. Now, Amos was a poor man that we can gather. He was, we know from Scripture, a herdsman. He was a literal shepherd of sheep. He wasn't using that in any kind of metaphoric, figurative language. Unlike the first couple of prophets, Hosea and Joel, Amos goes after the Gentile nations first, and then he goes after Israel and Judah, but whichever, Ephraim, you can call them about anything. But he first calls upon judgment in a very prosperous time. Much like Hosea, this was a growing economy, okay? So he was probably a very unpopular guy, Amos. Imagine just a poor farmer coming around and preaching and unto the Congress of the White House. That would have been about what it was like, because he goes and he preaches to everyone. But first, the Gentiles are called upon for their judgment, which will be Syria, Damascus, the Philistines, Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Tyre, Edom, and the Ammonites. Then upon Moab in chapter 2, there's a lot of focus on Moab, particularly for their cruelty towards the Edomites and their king. Now, apparently Moab, they had taken the body of the Edomite king, burned it into lime, which was a desecration of his body. Now, something about that, God just hates. We don't fully understand that, but Satanists, I've spoken in prior videos about this, Satanists will do that. They'll try to desecrate bodies of people, and they'll just in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But Moab is to be judged, and that is one of the reasons why they will be judged. Then judgment upon Israel is pronounced. Then judgment upon the women of Bashan, whom Amos refers to as cows. Yeah, he's pretty harsh against these. As there were many Jezebels roaming Samaria at that time. Amos is pretty much, he comes out of nowhere and just starts preaching to everyone. Not just Israel and Judah, but to all the nations around. He's just going after everyone. And he's a harsh prophet. He's what we would consider harsh. But he's preaching unto these Jezebels. And it is in the same chapter, chapter 4, that we read one of the most terrifying verses that I've ever read. Every time that I read it and I can't remember, and it doesn't come to my mind that it's in that chapter, it just gives me such cold chills because I'm so unprepared for it. Whenever he says, "Therefore, thus will I do unto thee, O Israel, and because I will do this unto thee, prepare to meet thy God, O Israel." And that always shakes me. Prepare to meet thy God. You know, it's just such a very moving, and it has a way of, it's captivating. We then read how God reduces armies and sees the crooked politicians. So he calls out these crooked politicians. I call Amos the inescapable judgment prophet for such verses as chapter 5, 18 through 20. Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord. To what end is it for you? The day of the Lord is darkness and not light, as if a man did flee from a lion, and a bear met him, or went into the house and leaned his hand on the wall, and a serpent bit him. Shall not the day of the Lord be darkness and not light, even very dark, and no brightness in it? So there's no escape. If a lion's running after you, you escape it. A bear will get you. If you put your hand on the wall, a serpent's going to bite you. You know, you're trying to feel around, trying to get away from. So many, many verses are like that with these minor prophets. Throughout the Bible, you'll see it's such terrifying illustrations like that. The final verse of chapter 5 hints at the possible pagan origins of modern Israel's Star of David. There's been controversy over this. It's a very debatable issue. But they say that the Star of David is actually the Star of Moloch. And I don't know. It reads like this. But you have borne the tabernacle of your Moloch, and Chion your images, the star of your God, which ye made to yourselves. Now some have said that that's the Star of David. I don't know. I'm never dogmatic on it. It's just food for thought. I don't think that we can know necessarily unless somebody is really versed in history. We then see in chapter 6 of Amos how God despises those who become overly comfortable in this evil world. Those who show apathy toward coming judgment are despised. Amos then witnessed 3 visions in chapter 7, the vision of the locust, a great fire burning in Israel, and the Lord using a plumb line, symbolically showing if Israel was standing upright or not. A plumb line was basically a way to, it's kind of like a carpenter's level. You know how you can put a level on something, and it'll show you that little bubble. Well, plumb line's kind of the same way. You see how upright something is by dangling this string, and it's got this little like iron plume or metallic plume, something down there just holding it, you know, to weigh it, and it kind of goes straight down. But it was symbolic in order to show those in whom were upright or not in Israel. Amos then tells of his persecution for preaching how King Jeroboam, now this would have been a terrifying thing to say, how even today this is not recommended. You can get arrested for stuff like this even today. How King Jeroboam II would die by the sword and war was coming to Israel. Chapter 8's focus appears to parallel Jeremiah's message of the end of the harvest. So you see a lot in Amos. I highly recommend reading Amos. I recommend reading all of these. This is the one reason why I'm doing this video, but particularly Amos, because that's just so filled. It's kind of like Philippians, how you can go to the New Testament, Philippians, and it's just a very short, concise, and very filled with knowledge, just within a few pages. You can probably read it in about 20 minutes, both of those. But he's talking about the end of the harvest, just like Jeremiah. Judgment upon the complacent churchgoers is then written in chapter 8, 4 through 7. Hear this, O ye that swallow up the needy, even to make the poor of the land to fail, saying, will the new moon be gone? that we may sell corn, and the Sabbath that we may set forth wheat, making the ephah small and the shekel great, and falsifying the balances by deceit, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of shoes, yea, and sell the refuse of the wheat. The Lord hath sworn by the excellency of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their works. Whenever they say this, and I've taught this in prior videos, I know, but when will the new moon be gone? That we may sell corn, and the Sabbath that we may set forth wheat, making the ephah small and the shekel great. You see, their focus is on money and their bellies and their wants and not their spiritual growth, but their physical growth. That's what they want, their economic growth, financial growth, so. And it's just like the modern churchgoers. You know, when's this service going to be over so we can go to Burger King? Or when's this service going to be over so we can go to a restaurant, or we can go home and watch the video, the game, or go to the movies? Or it's always something else that's physical, and they leave the spiritual behind. That's the point of that passage. But then we're told in the very same, just a few verses down, how there'll be a famine in the land. That's a judgment, a famine, but not a famine of bread, nor a thirst for water, but a hearing of the words of the Lord. And they shall wander from sea to sea, and from the north even to the east they shall run to and fro, and seek the word of the Lord, and shall not find it. But the final chapter 9 of Amos is a promise of restoration to come, as it will be during the time of the kingdom reign. So Amos speaks of the millennial reign of Christ as well. Now here we have Obadiah. Very short prophecies given within this. Not many prophecies. Really just a judgment upon Edom. And a very short single chapter book from the prophet Obadiah, whom some believe to be the same Obadiah. Now this is very debatable. Some believe to be the same Obadiah mentioned in 1 Kings 18:3, who worked in the courts of Ahab and Jezebel, and hid the prophets in a cave to protect them, the prophets, from Ahab and Jezebel's persecution. Now, this is very debatable. I wouldn't even say that is true, but that's just what some believe. I would say this was probably just a normal prophet like the rest. But the entire promise of this book is that of judgment to come upon the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, for their harsh treatment of Israel for so long. Total destruction is promised to the Edomites. Now, that could mean a total, because it is total destruction that they're promised. It may go down to all the way through their descendants, even into these days, speaking of the gathering of the nations, and then Christ comes back after God's wrath, and in order to establish his kingdom reign, wipes them out. And that's what I would say, honestly. Then we come to the fifth of the 12 minor prophets, which is Jonah. The most known of all the minor prophets, probably. Even little children know about Jonah. But Jonah was told by God to go preach unto Nineveh, the great city. It was called the greatest city in the world, Nineveh. Large city, massive, rich. They didn't worry about being invaded. It was the capital of Assyria. And Jonah was told, this little Jewish guy, was told, go preach unto Nineveh. That's like going into Manhattan. That's like the center of New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles, and had been told, you just come out of the farmland, so go preach unto Nineveh and try to get them to repent, or at least tell them of the judgment to come. He was terrified, is why he ran. He didn't run simply to disobey God. That wasn't Jonah. But he was probably very scared to go to Nineveh. It would have been a terrifying commission to be given. Go into this enormous city filled with pagans. You will find no friends there, and preach the word of judgment to come. Jonah was no doubt terrified. He therefore ran to Joppa and boarded a ship bound for Tarshish. Along the way, a great storm rose up. It was then that Jonah ordered them, the men on board who were pagans, he ordered them to throw him overboard in order to save the ship. It was then that we're told how Jonah was swallowed by a great fish, I believe it was a whale. And for 3 days and 3 nights, some believe that after Jonah prayed while in the whale's belly that he actually died in order to preserve his body. Just like how Christ died and went into the grave, Christ even alludes to what happened to Jonah in the whale's belly for 3 days and 3 nights. Okay, so some people believe, including myself, that Jonah went in, prayed a prayer, and died whenever he got in there. Okay, so it would have been nothing to have been in the whale's belly at that time. Now, he may have been awake for just a little bit of time, just a little while, but I highly doubt that his mentality, his psyche could have stood that. Jonah was then brought back to the shore, vomited up, rose, preached unto Nineveh for 40 days, leading to the people of Nineveh repenting. So this was an effective preacher. This angered Jonah upon hearing about them repenting, who then went and prayed for God to take his life, much like Elijah. Jonah then goes out of the city overlooking it. God then causes a gourd, which is it was a large plant, to grow up rapidly as a shade for Jonah, which was a sign unto Jonah that God was still with him and for him. So all the Jews seek signs. Not all of them, but most of the Jews, even back then, for all time, they've always sought a sign. You have to show us with our eyes before we'll believe. And the Greeks seek wisdom. So we're told about how this made Jonah very happy upon seeing this gourd grow up beside of him and give him shade. He became very happy. He falls asleep. And whenever he awoke, a worm, cankerworm, had eaten the gourd. As the sun was beaming down upon him, Jonah then wished again to die. He's very, very depressed, somewhat bipolar a little bit, because he seems to get really, really happy, and then he gets really, really sad, and then he wants to die. He went through a lot. So God then rebukes him, saying in the 2 final verses, this right here, about this gourd being ate away, and God makes a very, very good point to Jonah. Then said the Lord, Thou hast had pity on the gourd, the plant, for thee which thou hast not labored, neither madest it grow, which came up in a night, and perished in a night. And should not I spare Nineveh, that great city, wherein are more than 60,000 persons, 120,000 persons, that cannot discern between their right hand and their left hand, and also much cattle? And that's the end of the book of Jonah. God says, you seem to have more care for this plant than you do for these people in here, and whom have love and who have hate and who have a soul and who they could come to heaven, one day and be with me. He says, then they have repented. They have called out to me. He says, and you have no affection for them. You're angry because they repented. He says, you wanted them to be killed. You wanted judgment to come upon them. So he rebukes Jonah harshly for this, and rightly so. Now next up we have the prophet Micah. Micah's ministry was sometime between 739 and 686 BC. Micah preached around the same time as Isaiah, the major prophet, so he was kind of a contemporary. Like Amos, Micah was a poor man from the country, kind of a farmer of sorts, but much like Amos, Micah was a poor man, of Moresheth, which was 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem. He wasn't very far from Jerusalem. Commanded to go into the city of mighty Jerusalem and prophesy against the corrupt princes. Much like Amos, Micah was told to do also. Even the people he is to prophesy against, but particularly unto the princes. 1/3 of Micah deals with the sins of the people. Another third of his ministry describes the punishment to come upon them for their sins. And the final third promises restoration. It seems like God has this very strong desire to restore the good in which he sees. He wishes to keep that. But he's still a just judge. He must punish sin. God speaks to the crooked politicians, those who have, as Micah states, power in their hand. In chapter 2, 1-3. Woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. When the morning is light, they practice it because it is in the power of their hand. So even in the daytime, they're practicing this evil. And we see this in our own Congress. Through all the time, we see these Nancy Pelosi's, Hillary Clinton's, and Bernie Sanders. We see all these. They're evil, corrupt. They've always been. And they covet fields and take them by violence, and houses and take them away. So they oppress a man in his house, even a man in his heritage. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, Behold, against this family do I devise an evil, from which ye shall not remove your necks, neither shall ye go haughtily, for this time is evil. Micah likens the sermons of the city's false prophets, so he comes against the preachers of the city, the prophets of the city as well. Now this is a poor man coming up into these people, much like Christ, how he would go up and he would rebuke the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees. He would rebuke those rich, wealthy, exalted preachers of the city. But Micah likens their sermons to a bite from wolves, much like wolves in sheep's clothing. He likens them to this. Chapter 3 tells us how they do not feed the flock, but feed on them, in very graphic imagery as well. Verse 2 reads like this of chapter 3. They hate the good and love the evil. They pluck off their skin from off them, and their flesh from off their bones. That's what these false prophets are doing to the people who hear them. They're killing them. And they're not only killing them, they're destroying them and ravaging them and taking them for everything that they have, their money. They're even taking their skin away, figuratively. Micah then tells of judgment upon all crooked princes, priests, and prophets in chapter 3, 10 through 12. They build up Zion with blood and Jerusalem with iniquity. The heads thereof judge for reward, and the priests thereof, which is a bribe, the heads thereof judge for reward, and the priests thereof teach for hire, which is only for money, and the prophets thereof divine only for money. Yet will they lean upon the Lord and say, Is not the Lord among us? None evil can come upon us. Therefore shall Zion for your sake be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the house as the high places of the forest. So we read right there how everything was all about money. And Jesus says you cannot love God and money. God and mammon. We then read a final restoration in the millennial reign, the destruction of Israel's enemies. The famous prophecy of the baby born in Bethlehem is also found in Micah. It's in Micah 5:2. But the verse preceding it is a little known prophecy in itself. Not many people know about this one verse preceding it. Now gather thyself in troops, O daughter of troops. He hath laid siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel, which is Christ, with a rod upon the cheek. It mentions this in Matthew 27:30, how they struck Christ with a rod on his cheek. So it's talking, that's a prophecy of them striking Christ with, and then we read, But thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, thou, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. It's a beautiful verse, isn't it? But anyway, the rest of Micah is best summed up in the other famous verses of chapter 6, 6 through 8. Wherewith shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. Those are the words of Micah. Now next up we have the book of Nahum, which is the 7th of the 12. 100 years after Jonah preached unto Nineveh, and they repented. 100 years after, and they repented, the great Assyrian city forgot their revival. After 100 years, a new generation comes along, and they do tend to do that. and became as of old, sinning, transgressing, worshiping other gods, and there's no repentance in them. They sin during the daytime without care. Nahum prophesies their doom at the hands of the Babylonians. You have to understand at this particular time, so great were the Assyrians and so great was the city of Nineveh that they had rulership over Babylon, as well as these surrounding nations, including the kingdom of the northern kingdom of Israel. So these had great rule. This was a great and mighty nation. I mean, powerful. Okay, so they had rule over the Babylonians. But their doom was prophesied at the hands of the Babylonians. This came to pass in 612 BC, and in a revolt, conquering the Assyrians who ruled over them at that time. Nineveh was known at that time as the greatest city in the whole world. Various ancient monuments reveal just how cruel Assyrian rulers actually were. Now, they have found these ancient monuments, and they say on them, and I have many sayings from them, but I'll just give you a couple. They boasted of ripping the skin off of their enemies and adorning their outer walls with those skins. They would decapitate enemy officers and pile them up to form pillars for all to see, just heads of enemy officers piled up. They cut off limbs of their enemies and they would scatter them all throughout as a warning to everybody. I mean, it was just tragic, just how evil that these people truly were. They were a very cruel people, and in chapter 3 of Nahum, God shows the prophet the secrets within Nineveh in chapter 3. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit for you. The horseman lifted up both the bright sword and the glittering spear, and there is a multitude of slain, and a great number of carcasses, and there is none end of their corpses. They stumble upon their corpses, because of the multitude of their whoredoms, of the well-favored harlot. Now this is a people in whom their capital had a revival 100 years ago, but now we're starting to see why Jonah was so terrified to go into this butchering city. These were savages. Because of the multitude of the whoredoms of the well-favored harlot, the mistress of witchcrafts, tells you how evil that they had backslidden, that selleth nations through her whoredoms, and families through her witchcrafts. The final chapter of Nahum then ends like this. Thy shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Thy nobles shall dwell in the dust. Thy people is scattered upon the mountains, and no man gathereth them. There is no healing of thy bruise. Thy wound is grievous. All that hear the bruit or the news of thee shall clap the hands over thee. For upon whom hath not thy wickedness passed continually? People applaud the destruction of these people. That is how evil that these people were. They applaud the fact that they're gone because their wickedness passed continually upon all people. Now we come to the 8th of the minor prophets. It is believed Habakkuk prophesied sometime shortly after the fall of Nineveh, around 607 BC, we believe. He preached unto his people in Judah, warning of their need to repent or else be conquered. The prophet is astonished and heartbroken over this, seemingly unable to fully grasp the things which he sees coming to pass upon his people, the Jewish people of Judah. This lack of understanding may have led him, Habakkuk, to a great New Testament revelation that Paul seems to quote a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, which is recorded in chapter 2, verse 4 of Habakkuk, Habakkuk 2:4. Behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. So he could see horrible things, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing, so he said, well, I'm just taking this by faith, so I'm living by faith, not by sight. He says, because if I live by sight, it's going to tear me down. I have to believe that something good is going to come from all this. A great example of one living in the true faith. Even knowing the certainty of the coming judgment upon his people, Habakkuk concludes with this. Verse 18 of the final chapter. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. Much like Job, he says, the Lord giveth, naked came I out of the womb, naked shall I go back, meaning to the grave. He says, blessed is the name of the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, blessed is the name of the Lord. So, Habakkuk seems to have the same attitude. Now we come to Zephaniah, the ninth of the 12, the final of the pre-exile prophets, Zephaniah. He's the final one, then we'll get to the post-exile and Haggai. The final of the pre-exile prophets. Among these minor prophets, as Jeremiah and Ezekiel were major prophets around Zephaniah's time. Zephaniah basically sums up much of the previous 8 minor prophets. He hits on their major points. He was also of royal lineage, particularly from the lineage of Hezekiah, King Hezekiah. So he was unlike other prophets. Okay, Zephaniah, he had royalty within him, which also put his life in danger a couple of times as well. We'll get into that some other time. The preaching of Zephaniah, it is believed, may have moved the good King Josiah, a good king of Judah, to help usher in a revival among the Jews. A revival which brought only outward change, though. The people remained dreadfully corrupt inwardly. Many view Zephaniah's prophecies also pertaining to these last days, as well as their return from exile. So he's talking about the immediate sense, and then he's talking about the latter days, which I do believe. I do believe this, and I can kind of prove this in due to such verses as chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. Therefore wait ye upon me, saith the Lord, until the day that I rise up to the prey. For my determination is to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation, even all my fierce anger. For all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. Into which we see that in the great supper of God, the battle of Armageddon. For then will I turn to the people a pure language. Okay? A pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. So, obviously, that's not happened. That didn't happen after the return from exile, after the 70 years in Babylon. That didn't happen then. That still has to happen. A pure language will be given to everybody on the earth so that we can all communicate. Because it'll be Jesus ruling instead of Nimrod. So the Tower of Babel, people won't have to babble anymore and speak different languages to confuse everybody. But we'll all be in one consent. Now for the 10th minor prophet of the 12, the first post-exile prophet was Haggai. Around 520 BC, we can date the ministry of Haggai, as he is the first of the 3 post-exile minor prophets. Once the Persian king Cyrus released the Jews in 538 BC, it took the poor remnant in Judah about 2 years, okay? So after Cyrus releases them, they have a poor people on over there then, because remember, they're not able to gather a lot of wealth in Babylon. So they're released. They go back to their land. It's all rubble. Everything's rubble. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed everything. So it took about 2 years to appoint a governor whose name was Zerubbabel to lead in the construction of the second temple. After 2 more years, the work stopped. 14 years later, so right here we have 18 years, around 520 BC is when Haggai steps in and the temple rebuilding continued. Ezra the priest, the same Ezra of the book of Ezra, another major overseer of the temple's reconstruction, mentioned Haggai twice in Ezra 5:1 and 2 and Ezra 6:14. Haggai's basic message is summed up in Haggai 1:2 through 4. Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. Then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie waste? He says, you come back and you build your own houses. Why can't you build mine? See, so he's calling them out to do this. Now, in the next prophet, we see a little bit of a different perspective and a different message. Instructions on keeping clean the temple and future blessings for Zerubbabel are then noted. It is then that we come to the prophet Zechariah, who, out of all the minor prophets, I would say this one is, you could say that he was just like Daniel and Revelation. He's just almost identical. Everybody talks about, whenever they talk about these latter days, Daniel and Revelation, Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, but they never hardly mention Zechariah. I would highly recommend everyone to study Zechariah, but you have to look up commentary like I did, sources of greater wisdom that have looked into this historically, and just to find out what he's talking about. But anyway, Zechariah is set a couple of months after Haggai's first prophecy, because you see a few different prophecies. So just a couple of months, Zechariah comes along. So God's sending these prophets out right away. Where Haggai emphasized the temple, its reconstruction, Zechariah emphasizes the hearts of the people. Because God wanted the temple rebuilt, and then he seemingly said, okay, now you have to get your hearts right. Because this is a whole new generation. All the others, and it even says in these minor prophets that of the final three minor prophets, it says the old has died. They're no longer here. Now you all are established, and it can be a new thing. It's much like how Moses in the wilderness, how a whole generation had to die off because they weren't with God, and God wanted to establish something new. The millennial reign is a major focal point in Zechariah, even in chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. Sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for lo, I come, and I will dwell in the midst of thee, saith the Lord. And many nations shall be joined to the Lord in that day, and shall be my people, and I will dwell in the midst of thee, and thou shalt know that the Lord of hosts hath sent me unto thee. So there we're seeing many nations coming unto the Lord, who is in the midst of the people. That's Christ, the millennial reign. Blessings upon Joshua the high priest, not Joshua of old, but Joshua was appointed as the high priest of the new generation that came out of exile. Zerubbabel was the governor. Joshua was the high priest. And they are to lead in restoring Judea. Zechariah then has other visions. He has visions early on, then he has other visions. Chapter 6 being similar to Revelation 6, mention of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. He sees, I'm almost certain that he sees the four horsemen way before John the Revelator did, John the Beloved. Zechariah then sees Christ saving his people in the last day. Several astounding, already fulfilled prophecies we then read in Zechariah concerning the betrayal of Judas Iscariot and the 30 pieces of silver in chapter 11, 12, and 13. They would look upon him whom they pierced. All these are from Zechariah. He's talking about Judas betraying Christ. He's talking about Christ being pierced. Sees Christ then in the temple. He sees Christ in the temple. Sees him in the millennial reign. The sheep scattering once the shepherd was struck in chapter 13, verse 7. Zechariah closes with details regarding events occurring during the millennial reign, such as the punishment upon those nations, Egypt specifically is noted, who will refuse to keep the Feast of Tabernacles in that day. So we're being told that there will be feast held in that day, and we are to come and celebrate with Christ in that day. Okay? So we're told about these punishments, which are plagues upon Egypt and others in whom refuse. So because there'll be some that refuse to do that in the millennial reign. But do you see how Zechariah is so important? I am summing him up. I have so many in-depth studies on all these prophets, but I can't just come out because it's going to be a long, long video. It's going to be pretty long anyway. The final of not only the 12 minor prophets, but also of the entire Old Testament. We read the writings of the prophet Malachi. 100 years after the return from exile, in the days of Nehemiah, Malachi's ministry begins. Malachi delivers the final prophecy from God to Israel. It is obvious God has had enough at this point. And it is plain as day. God tells why. He gives reasons why. He's just not going to support them. If then I be a father, where is mine honor? And if I be a master, where is my fear, saith the Lord of hosts unto you? O priests that despise my name, and ye say, wherein have we despised thy name? Ye offer polluted bread upon mine altar. And ye say, wherein have we polluted thee? in that ye say, the table of the Lord is contemptible. And if ye offer the blind for a sacrifice, is it not evil? And if ye offer the lame and sick, is it not evil? Offer it now unto thy governor. Will he be pleased with thee? Or accept thy person, saith the Lord of hosts. He says you're doing things that fallible, dying, imperfect men, sinning men would not be pleased with. And you think, I, the perfect God of heaven, am pleased with what you do for me? He then sums up the matter in the first chapter and says this, which is very, very disheartening. But ye have profaned it, in that ye say, the table of the Lord is polluted, and the fruit thereof, even his meat, is contemptible. Ye said also, behold, what a weariness it is, and ye have snuffed at it, saith the Lord of hosts. And ye brought that which was torn, and the lame, and the sick. Thus ye brought an offering. Should I accept this at your hand, saith the Lord? But cursed be the deceiver, which hath in his flock a male, and voweth, and sacrificeth unto the Lord a corrupt thing. For I am a great king, saith the Lord of hosts, and my name is dreadful among the heathen. See what they were doing? They were bringing these lackluster sacrifices to him because their hearts were not with him. They didn't really care much about God at that time, not at all. They didn't care enough to even bring that. They would bring the blind and the sick and all these rams. They were dying anyway, and they were pitiful sacrifices. It wasn't so much the sacrifice itself. It was their heart towards God that he despised. And we read of that right here. For the next 400 years after Malachi, God would be silent. God gives very specific reason for his silence, which I'm certain this verse was read over and over and over again by the Jews for the next 4 centuries. That's longer than we've been a nation in America. That's a long time. But God says this to them. One of the final words that God says, and I bet they just kept repeating this. Ye have wearied the Lord with your words. Yet ye say, wherein have we wearied him? When ye say, every one that doeth evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delighteth in them. Or where is the God of judgment? The very next verse tells what he's going to do after 400 years. That is really his final word. And then the 400-year gap is right in between there. And then we read this. Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant, whom ye delight in. Behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts. But notice he gives the reason for this 400 years. Ye have wearied the Lord with your words. He says, I'm tired of it. He says, I don't want to hear it anymore. I'm done. The final prophecy given is recorded in the final chapter, chapter 4 through 6 of the Old Testament, and these are the final words of God unto his people. Remember ye the law of Moses my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all Israel with the statutes and judgments. He's saying, be good. It's like a dad going away somewhere. Be good. Remember, keep the rules. Remember the rules of the house. Keep them. I'll come back, but it's going to be a little while. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. And those are the final words of God unto the Jewish people. What he says is, I'm going to send Elijah. Now this is just one final note. We believe that Elijah is one of the 2 witnesses based upon this prophecy. One of the main reasons why they rejected Jesus as the Messiah was because they said, well, Elijah's supposed to come and restore all things. He's supposed to come first, and then the Messiah comes back. Elijah readies the people. And what does Jesus say? He says, and Elijah has already come, and you knew him not, meaning John the Baptist. He says, but if you'll accept it, he says, Elijah's already come. And Christ says that John the Baptist was a greater prophet than Elijah was. He did no miracle, but there's a reason for that, because Jesus was supposed to do all the miracles. No spotlight was supposed to be upon John the Baptist. We'll talk about that another time. But those are the 12 minor prophets of the Old Testament, y'all. Now you see why they're so important and crucial. I beckon you to read them for yourself. If you spent a day or two, you could easily get through all of them. And you would just learn so much. I skimmed over so many details that I have recorded myself on each and every single one of them, but for your sake, I had to save time. So, hope you all have a good day. May the God of peace and the God of mercy forever be with you all. Amen.